Greetings, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Joint International Conference with Ecological Economics. This is the panel discussion. And so this is the 7th Degrowth and 16th ISEE, International Society for Ecological Economics Conference, titled Building Alternative Livelihoods in Times of Ecological and Political Crisis. Now, this is a panel discussion. Joining me is the internationally acclaimed Naomi Klein. I'm going to actually have to read her bio. It's so long and impressive. So to those of you who do not know, Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, columnist, and author of the international bestsellers No Logo, The Shock Doctrine, This Changes Everything, No Is Not Enough, and On Fire. All have been translated into over 30 languages. Her most recent book is How to Change Everything, The Young Human's Guide to Protecting the Planet and Each Other. She is a senior correspondent for The Intercept, Puffin Writing Fellow at Hype Media Center, an inaugural Marielle Franco Fellow of the Social Justice Initiative Portal Project at the University of Chicago, and is currently the inaugural Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies at Regis University. She was a co-author of Canada's The LEAP Manifesto and a co-founder of the climate justice organization, The LEAP. She joins the University of British Columbia in September 2021 in the Department of Geography as chair of the Center for Climate Justice. Wow, that is a very impressive bio. We are so privileged and honored to have you join us in this panel discussion. Along with myself, Lerato Padi, I'm joined by Rigo Melga, as well as Constanza. They will briefly introduce themselves. So this panel discussion is basically about stop greenwashing the sustainability transition and a conversation with Naomi Klein on the need for systemic change. Over to you, Rigo.
Hi, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Vermont. I've been very much involved with the divestment movement since 2012. And we finally got UVM divested last year. So we're very excited about that, and just very excited to have Naomi with us today.
And I'm Constanza Casal de Rey. I'm from Argentina. I am also a PhD candidate, and I'm very much interested and concerned about economicism in political decisions regarding environmental policies, environmental protection. So I'm very happy to be here and having this opportunity.
Okay. Thanks, Constanza. So my name is Lerato. I hail from South Africa. I hold a PhD in agricultural economics from the University of KwaZulu-Natal and currently a lecturer and researcher at the University of Pretoria. Now, by profession, I'm an agricultural economist, but I have a passion for ecological economists as I believe it is crucial in the sustainability of the global system as we know it. Now, over to you, Naomi. Could you please just give a brief introduction about yourself and why are you interested? What is your standpoint in the whole sustainability, climate change, ecological economics, and degrowth?
Sure. Well, it's wonderful to be in conversation with all of you, and I won't talk for too long on that huge question, just so that we have more time to go back and forth. You know, I am now working in academia, as you said. I've been at Rutgers, and I'm going to be starting at UBC. University of British Columbia recently passed a climate emergency declaration. And is, I suppose, kind of trying to figure out what that means. What does it mean for scholars to say we are in a climate emergency? That should inform how we work. And now after having made that declaration, we're now kind of figuring out what that means. So as you mentioned, I'm going to be helping launch a new Center for Climate Justice, which is going to be trying to break down silos between different academic disciplines, and also between the university and communities that are really on the front lines of fossil fuel extraction, transportation, which is a huge issue where I live, with oil pipelines and oil tankers and the threat that they pose to our ecology. And where this intersects with Indigenous land rights, because this is unceded Indigenous land, and all kinds of lip service is paid to this idea, but not very much else. And so, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry about this. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, just hold on. I hope that doesn't happen again. Okay. Yeah, so but I don't come from academia. I come from journalism, and I've been reporting on sites of climate disaster for a long time. So what really brought me to this was actually when I was writing the book, The Shock Doctrine, I went to New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina and really saw the intersection of a legacy of slavery, systemic racism, layered on top of 40 years of neoliberal austerity, intersecting with heavy weather of the kind that we are seeing more and more of in the context of climate change, and just seeing how all of these forces make what would be a disaster truly catastrophic. And so that's what brought me into this. I am not somebody who's been studying climate my whole life. I'm much more identified with economic and social justice. But Katrina was my wake-up call, where I was like, okay, climate is about that. Climate is about economic justice. It is about racial justice. It is about gender justice. This isn't an issue we can just kind of outsource. One thing I would just say that's, I suppose, is relevant to a conversation about degrowth and the work that you all do around ecological economics is that in the first sort of stages of my research, I think I really thought that I was writing about a clash between neoliberal capitalism and what it requires to respond to the climate emergency, and sort of understanding how the framework of neoliberalism and deregulation and privatization and public austerity is in conflict with the kinds of policies that it would require to rapidly transition our economies. But as I dug deeper into what it would actually take to decarbonize on the time frame that we have left, it became clear that it really is not just a clash with neoliberal capitalism. It is a clash with the logic of growth itself and of extractivism underneath that. And so that's the sort of circuitous route that brought me, I guess, to this conversation with you. That and the fact that my parents were friends with Josh Farley's parents. Actually, I think our grandparents, right, Josh?
Oh, okay. Actually, touching on degrowth, as we know, the bigger economies are still on the path of wanting to expand, with somehow some sort of an assumption that there is no limits to what that can do to our ecosystem and our environment. Now, with degrowth is the notion that the bigger economy should be able to contract in a way, in a planned and sustainable manner, so that we can reach some sort of a steady state where we can be producing within our biophysical limits. Now, do you think it is possible in our generation? And if so, what is the role of policy and academia? How do you think that could shape us getting to that point of degrowth? And yeah, do you basically think it is possible?
I mean, I think that there is a greater understanding that we are in a system crisis as opposed to a symptom crisis than at any point that I've been politically aware. And I think that there's just an understanding that the system that is producing the ecological crisis is the same system that is producing a crisis of inequality, of racial injustice, of gender hierarchies and exclusions, and that no, it's not going to solve kind of any of these crises. I see a real generational shift going on, where certainly the undergraduates who I teach are just becoming more radical with every cohort, more radical in the sense of really wanting to go to the roots, really wanting to talk about capitalism and understand it. So I would say that the chances of thinking of getting to a point where we would really be looking at very different economic indicators for what a good society is. I think that's imaginable in our lifetimes, certainly your lifetimes. You're younger than me. And hopefully my lifetime. And the speed with which we've seen frameworks like a Green New Deal kind of enter the political discussion just since 2018 is pretty impressive. Granted, I think we all agree that the way in which it gets discussed for the most part is still too shallow, is still not reckoning with the need to consume less as opposed to just differently. I think we're still in that phase, I think particularly in the United States, where you can talk about different kinds of consumption, but not actually consuming less, right? So immediately the discussion becomes, are you going to take away my hamburgers? Are you going to take away my cheap air travel? And then the response is often, no, don't be silly. But of course, it is true that we need to reckon with less, consuming more rationally, and limiting how much we travel, how much meat is eaten. Like and the political leaders that we have so far are all still running away from the question of less. And so, I think one of the roles that engaged scholarship can play in this is really helping people understand what less could mean in a way that is still a good life, right? And so something concrete, like, Theoria Francos is a wonderful scholar who's written a lot about lithium and its impact on the solar and what it means, in terms of, in Chile and Bolivia, but really anywhere, because it's such a water intensive extraction process. And so, everybody having an electric car is not an actual solution. But we're not yet engaged. I feel like there's very, very little helpful research about how to really recycle in existing metals and minerals in our production. I mean, when I started to research this for This Changes Everything, I was sort of staggered by how little good research there is out there. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, what research would be helpful? What is some of the most exciting academic work that's happening in this area?
All right. Before I hand over to Constanza, I think with the degrowth ideology and way of thinking, I'm more wondering, coming from the global south, coming from Africa in particular, is what are the implications for us, the countries that have had less, in trying to bridge that gap to getting to a steady state and getting the bigger economies to come down to that less, would it be fair? Even in terms of the economic indicators that we look at when we're talking about economic growth, because with degrowth, then we're looking at the bigger economies trying to scale down. But the problem is that when we consider, for instance, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Ghana, and maybe Kenya are one of the biggest economies in Africa. However, the inequality is still very high. So it's only a very small portion of the population that can actually say they can actually come down to less. So how, as the developing countries and the underdeveloped countries, how would we bridge that gap to get into that steady state? And would it be fair to say now we're all thinking about consuming less when we've never even had the opportunity to consume less? Just those are the kind of things that I would look at, or I would be interested or think that it's missing in this talk of ecological sustainability and economics. Also considering the factors that we are, if we're looking at with extraction of our minerals and so forth, there's so many issues, social issues surrounding that, like child labor, unfair practices, low wages for the people that are actually working there, and in general, not getting the value or the benefit of our resources as Africans. So, and then we're dealing with fighting hunger. So how do we intertwine this trying to fight for social justice and ecological justice together? So I think that's where academia should actually like start focusing at, and it should, I don't think it should be a one size fits all sort of studies. It would be definitely different for the North Americas, for instance, and Europe and the global South. But yeah, so that's what I think. But let me just hand it over to Constanza. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you were talking about lithium, and well, Rigo here is like the expert in energy transition, so I rather he talk about it first, and then I'll go. Rigo.
Okay, I can jump in happily. Well, I'm just very happy to have Naomi here. I've been an admirer of her for like many years with Bill McKibben. They've done a lot of great work. But getting to the energy transition, I guess now, I mean, basically, if we're going to move to low carbon economies, we have to rethink how the economic system. And that's something that Naomi has been thinking a lot about and writing a lot about. And basically, I mean, in recent times, most of the sustainability plans that have been proposed, such as the Green New Deal and others, whether here in the United States or in Europe, they have been about maintaining kind of like the same system. They're trying to like work with the same system that we've been having for so many decades. But the problem is that by trying to decouple the system with economic growth from resources, that is just not going to be possible or feasible maybe in the time that we need it to. Like we have 10 years, however long. But so many ecological economists believe that not being straightforward with people about the need to change our consumption patterns and adapt our expectations to low carbon future results in greenwashing sustainability transition. So Naomi, you have been writing a lot about social and environmental dangers of unfettered capitalism. Can you talk a little about institutions, countries, or regions of the planet that you think give us hope and that we can learn from to achieve the systemic change that is needed to advance real as opposed to greenwash sustainability?
I wish there were more places that we could point to. At a national level, I think it's tricky. But first I would just say that I think that degrowth is a helpful framework in academia. I think it's a helpful framework for research that we need to reckon with. As kind of outward-facing movement messaging, I've always argued that degrowth is not a particularly helpful frame for the reasons that Loretta was just talking about. That so much of the world is living with not enough, and that a lot of what we need to be defining is what makes a good life as well, even for over consumers, right? And so a lot of what people just hear when they hear degrowth is just my life is going to be worse, right? As opposed to my life is going to be different. We're going to be valuing different things. And people who do not have enough are going to have more, right? Which is what I think the reason why we talk about climate justice, right, which includes within it redistribution, right? It includes within it core principles of justice, which is that the people who created the crisis pay the biggest burden, pay the biggest cost, and the people who have bearing the brunt of the impacts of the crisis and did the least to produce it have some kind of reparation for that, right? And that takes the form of transfers of resources and wealth, including the capacity to leapfrog over fossil fuels, sharing green technology, open sourcing intellectual property, things like that. And it's been, I think, a shame that a lot of the ways in which we've talked about a Green New Deal in the United States have appropriated this discourse, which comes from the global South. Like I first heard about this from organizers in Ecuador who were putting forward the plan to save the Yasuni, African organizers in the Niger Delta who were asking for reparations for the destruction of their lands and waters. And these ideas, as they moved north, then kind of came into the America First frame, and we end up with, presidential candidates talking about a Green New Deal and greening the military and beating China, in the race, for green tech and things like that. That's not what climate justice is, right? So I think there's a lot of work that we need to do in order to define and reclaim. So I don't know if that answers this at all, what you are getting at, Rico, but maybe ask me again if what I'm not answering.
I think it was great to, I didn't know many of those things, how the discourse was coming from the global south that has been adopted here in North America. But talking about redistribution, right? You have been heavily involved in the fossil fuel divestment movement. And it has been pretty successful. Last time I checked, there were like, I think 12 or $15 trillion that had been divested from around the world. So do you think that the fossil fuel divestment movement that you've been a part of has the potential to enable the systemic change that we need for the sustainability transition? Like, our current financial system basically transfers interest payments to the private sector, which is akin to a tax on investment. How do we finance this transition without transferring more wealth to the financial sector?
Well, I think we need public financing. I think we need public banks. I think waiting for the private sector to fix this for us and to just have the right financial incentives in place is a recipe for disaster and a recipe for very damaging forms of green extractivism, of so-called green extractivism. Because yes, I have been part of the fossil fuel divestment movement, and this is something that Bill McKibben and I kind of kicked off together. Although I didn't go on tour because I had a newborn, but we sort of understood when we looked at that original research about stranded assets, right, and the fact that if governments were to do what scientists were telling them they needed to do, we would have many trillions of dollars worth of stranded fossil fuel assets. And that just wasn't going to happen without political pressure, right? And that was why companies like Shell and Chevron were reassuring their shareholders after the Paris Agreement was negotiated, don't worry, it's non-binding. We're not going to actually have to do this, right? And so the fossil fuel divestment movement is about creating a kind of a market crisis. But to me, it was never just about letting the market solve this. It was really about a political strategy to render these companies toxic in and of themselves, because, every time you and other students have been out there making the argument for why your universities should not be invested in fossil fuels, you're making an argument that these are immoral companies, that they that they're not just any other investment. That they're investments at war with the possibility of a safe future. Now, that same argument is starting to trickle up into the way the Sunrise Movement is pushing politicians not to take fossil fuel money. And it's also starting to trickle up to pressure on television stations not to run fossil fuel advertisements, and newspapers not to produce fossil fuel advertisements, because they actually make the ads for them. They make advertorials for them. And that is where we really reduce the political power of the fossil fuel sector. I don't think this is just going to be a market solution. I think that we made a kind of a market argument that really is about creating the political space for us to regulate fossil fuels, if that makes sense. And to break apart some of the dependencies between our media and our politicians and the fossil fuel sector.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I was just going to ask you one more question quickly about, I believe that one of the main problems that we have as a society in North America and elsewhere around the world, especially in highly countries that consume a lot of resources, is that to achieve real sustainability, we need to have get people to understand what energy actually is and how we are completely dependent on it. I feel like a lot of people just turn on the switch or like get on their cars and drive. Nobody really gets to think about it or understand where everything comes. It's like when you go to the supermarket, same thing. Most of your food, you don't know where it comes from. So this lack of understanding of the nature of energy has fed, I think, has fed into a dualism and disconnection that exists between humans and the rest of nature. And that is driving all of this unsustainability problems. So what do you think is the role of academia in reducing this disconnection when most of the curriculum at all levels of higher education has been developed during the fossil fuel era of abundance that ignores our complete dependence on the environment for our survival, and mostly teaches people how to exploit natural resources faster than understanding their finite nature and the need for us to be resourceful to create more intelligent and long-lasting civilization. You know?
I like the use of the word resourceful there. And I think it is a challenge for post-secondary, but I would also argue, and maybe that it's even more of a challenge for pre-secondary. I think part of what we suffer from is this idea of a kind of a common curriculum for K to 12, which renders the world generic, right? When actually what we should be learning, what our kids should be learning from a very young age, is the specifics of their own ecosystem. One of the hopes that I had during the pandemic was that, because outdoor education is safer in the context of COVID, that we would rise to the challenge of getting kids outside more, getting kids in nature more, and really learning about where they live, and not just, the kinds of trees in their area, but also where our energy comes from, where our garbage goes to. I think kids should be going on field trips to garbage dumps and recycling depots, and really learning at a very, very young age. And I think that that we can play a role in post-secondary in helping design really exciting curricula for middle school and high school teachers to really start this at a very young age, because kind of by the time that you get to university, your worldview is a little bit locked in when it comes to the relationship with the natural world. I mean, we can push beyond it, but yeah, I'm in favor of starting early.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I was also trying to get at the higher education situation, which, the reason why in the past 40 years we got neoliberalism established in the United States and then exported to the rest of the world was because there was this heavy investment in economic departments specifically by people who were behind, liberalizing everything and making sure everything was privatized, and to basically transfer as much wealth as we could to the wealthiest. And if we, for example, wanted to have more ecological economists as opposed to neoliberal economists, we would need to get people behind that and invest in professors, in graduate students. So that's kind of like, I was just trying to, if you.
I love that. Yeah, that's great. It'd be like the Vermont school as an antidote to the Chicago school. Yeah. Maybe it shouldn't be in the United States at all, given the track record. But no, I mean, as you know, I spent a lot of time studying the huge impact of this actually relatively small program at the University of Chicago, that moved hundreds of Latin American economic students, and also franchised it to different economics departments in Chile and Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. But it's kind of amazing the bang for the buck that the State Department and the Ford Foundation got out of that decision to indoctrinate a generation of economic students in this extreme free market ideology. I'm not sure I love this sort of franchise model, but I do think that we, as ecological thinkers, we know that centralization is part of the problem, and that we need specificity as much as possible. So the problem, we can't replicate their methods because we don't believe one size fits all. If you believe, as Larry Summers said, and I quoted him in the Shock Doctrine, the same rules work everywhere. Spread the word, spread the doctrine. If we believe that the same rules worked everywhere, it would be much easier to be an ecological economist. But I think there are core principles that we do need to proliferate.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Constanza, who I know has many good questions to ask you.
Thank you.
Hi, Naomi. Thank you.
Hi.
Well, first, just a quick commentary about what Lerato was talking about degrowth and the contradiction of degrowth for us in developing countries. And I think degrowth has some problems in that respect. I also think from Latin America, at least, we have the Buen Vivir movement, for instance, life, and it has some points in common with degrowth. And I think one thing that I like about degrowth, like it's being proposed in Europe, is this idea of we don't need more jobs. What we need is to work less hours, so the job that there is can be distributed between people that don't have jobs, right? And when reading about the Green New Deal, I was very much interested in this Leaders Summit that President Biden hosted on climate. My president was there, and their opening speeches, right, was all about the new Green Deal is going to be about more jobs. It's going to be about, like growth. The Green New Deal is going to be about, it's not only not going to be about degrowth or about keeping things as they are, they're going to be better. We're going to grow more. And that was scary on one part, right? Because I was like, well, this is like nothing to do with what we want. And but I do think that there are alternatives like this one, right? From degrowth, like, well, redistribute work, like diminish the work day, 6 hours a day, everybody would have jobs. Like I know it's utopic, but I think
sounds good to me.
Yeah, I think that an argument, because sometimes the problem is selling it, right? Like you said, like politicians can't sell it. So we have to also think from academia, I think, of the ways they can sell it. I mean, and we're not used to it. We're not used to working like that in our minds, but maybe saying, okay, well, maybe you have less things, but you have more time. Not less of things means less of everything. You would have more time to spend with your kids, to grow your own food, like with this crisis, with the COVID crisis where I live in Patagonia, well, in all of Argentina, actually, there was like a boom of small greenhouses, right? People were like growing lettuce in their backyards or things like that. And it was beautiful in a way, right? I mean, the smallest actions that we can do, right? Like so I think that these are alternatives, and all the, like what Rigo was asking, what other countries can we look at to find other ways of life? I think these other ways of life are already happening. In farmer communities. I mean, it's hard to see it when we live in big cities, or but it's doable. But it has to be accompanied, I think, with land distribution, and that is like for instance, in Argentina, that's a big no. And that brings me to my question. That was just something I was thinking about, what you were talking about. That has to do with what you mentioned, green extractivism, right? Like green grabbing also, like green grabbing, land grabbing, the relationship between that. I live in Patagonia, in a foresty area, in Bariloche, where land is subject to high speculation, right? Like real estate speculation. Land is really expensive as it is, because it's beautiful, basically, because it's just lakes and forests and pristine nature. And when I hear, for instance, in this summit that Biden gave, that hosted, the president of the IMF, nonetheless, saying that for climate policies to work, carbon pricing has to go from the $2 it has now to $75. But that could translate into more land grabbing, because forests are going to become a huge source of richness, of money for many people that can speculate with that.
Yeah.
So that brings me to my question, right? Like, what do you think about this like payment for ecosystem services schemes, and how can we make them work for us and not for the financial big ones?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot in all of your questions. Forests are already being used in this way, and particularly in Brazil, but I mean, in many other contexts, and this has been disastrous for indigenous people because they get locked out of their land, they get criminalized on their land. It's just, as you say, it's a green grab, a land grab, and coming from a part of where I'm in British Columbia, and we're very nervous about wildfires as we are every summer, the idea that forests are any kind of stable carbon sink is absolutely ridiculous in the context of climate disruption. All of our forests are tremendously precarious, can go up in flames at any point. And so to use them as an excuse for more high carbon lifestyles makes absolutely no sense. I think we agree on that. And yet there is a need to support communities because, coming back to Rico's question, I don't think there are countries necessarily that we can point to, but we can point to areas where there's a richness in a worldview and in a vision for the kind of transition that we need. I've done some research in Puerto Rico post Hurricane Maria, and the visions for agroecology and for energy democracy and smaller grids, and it's all there, and it's rooted in an anti-colonial history, and people know what they want. They just frankly don't have the political power in the context of a colonial relationship to stand up to vulture capitalists that are preying on the island, and just succeeded in privatizing the electricity grid despite enormous opposition, and despite the many wonderful plans for how to have had Hurricane Maria be a catalyst for a true energy democratic transition. Yeah, I mean, I am cynical about the idea that we just monetize nature and just I think the extractive mindset, it's a doubling down on the idea that money is more important than life. We need a shift in worldview, but there are communities that want to do the right thing, that have ideas, and that do need some kind of economic support. Now, what is the framework for that support? This brings us back to, I think, Loretta's point and this core issue around climate debt and climate justice, right? There should be payment. And that was the vision for the Yasuni, that was the vision of, we don't actually want to fell this incredibly biodiverse rainforest in order to get at the oil, but we actually do need money for our own energy transition and for healthcare and for education. So we can't say to Ecuador, this is all on you to keep that oil underground and protect, this carbon sequestering rainforest. We actually, as a global community, have to have a transfer of wealth. And no, the market isn't going to do that for us. That actually has to be done with public policy. It has to be done with transfers of wealth that are not aid, that are not loans, that are justice. And so this is why I think that the climate justice frame is our most useful frame, right? Because it starts from the premise that we are in the middle of a crime, and that crime demands repair, and it demands justice, and that justice is on both the ends of the people who are being harmed and also the people who did the harm.
Right. Well, actually, in this summit, that I keep referring to.
I'm sorry you
is our
traumatized yourself in this way. I made the decision to just not pay attention to the summit.
Good. That was a good decision. Yeah.
Yeah.
Our president actually, well, he talked about us. Well, Argentina has like a really bad experience with IMF, you know, and we have huge debt. We have had huge debt. Then we clear that. Then another right president came and indebted us again, and we're facing a real, like, I think it's the biggest loan that the IMF has given any country. We have it now. So our president, he said, well, we need to strive for financial justice, he also said. And like he talked about a debt swap, right? I think that's the word for like an exchange of debt. Like, okay, so we have environmental services, you and owe you a lot of money, so let's just raise the debt situation and start over, I guess. I think, I don't know, what do you think about that? What do you think about that strategy?
I mean, I think we need a debt for nature swaps.
I think
yeah,
it's weird.
It's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, look, I think we should have had a debt jubilee in the context of COVID, and so I guess I've heard wariness from friends and colleagues in the global South about linking the erasure of debt and really debt justice to protection of nature or ecosystem services. But yeah, I mean, what do you think of that? What are the warning bells for you about connecting those two things?
Well, how many, like, if you fall into monetization is the word, of ecosystem services, because you would have to do like an inventory of all the ecosystem services that you will provide, and how much they cost, or representing monetary, and that just to do that operation, that's neoliberalism, that's marginalism. That's like, you know, so I think that's a trap as well. But it's really, it's tempting. It's tempting. It's really tempting, right? For country level, right? For a country level, because the problem also, I think, with these schemes of payment for ecosystem services, it tends to be that it never really gets to the people, like the people that live in the forests. It's like held up by the governments that receive the money, and then what happens with that? So, but I wanted to know what you thought, because I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I know. Yeah, I mean, I think, as you say, this is, Enrico's mentioning in the chat that China indebted Ecuador, and now 25% of the oil reserves belong to China, and that's a much worse use of debt, certainly. But I agree that I think it all has some pretty insidious implications, and what we do need are some other models for how we get resources to communities. And this, you know, this includes, you know, the challenge around, you know, the climate financing mechanism created by the UNFCCC. It also really doesn't get down to the community level. And so even, you know, I was part of Bernie Sanders's campaign for president, and I, you know, the big reason why I decided to kind of throw in for Bernie was because Bernie was the only candidate who was talking about a transfer of wealth to, you know, and paying the US's ecological debt. He didn't use the phrase ecological debt, but he said the US should pay $200 billion into the UN climate financing, you know, vehicle. But that vehicle, and that's great, but that vehicle, as we know, has been abused and is no guarantee that it's going to really go to the communities that are developing the most, you know, exciting ecological models. So this is a role that I could see post-secondary education playing in terms of developing some sort of certification models that communities could use to get support on the international stage, not through carbon credits and things like that, but maybe through a UN climate financing mechanism. So, you know, your community gets certified as really being a climate justice and initiative, and then that the money goes to the community. I don't know if you've seen some examples of that are promising, but I think that is something that engaged scholarship could be working on.
Okay.
I haven't, but I don't know if Lerato has. I haven't seen any of that, but that would be a good solution, I guess.
Well, I know there is some work starting on this. Yeah,
Good.
we can talk about it offline.
It sounds like a very good initiative, very way to work around actually redistributing some of the wealth to the less fortunate. However, in the context of Africa and the developing countries where there's high political instability, there's, if it's not war, it's famine, there's HIV and AIDS, and now COVID. So we also have the plague of corruption throughout the whole continent.
Right.
So it now not only becomes a problem of just individuals and communities just striving to, you know, be ecologically friendly or to sustainably use their resources, but then also the bucks ends up stopping with the institutional arrangements that are in place. So I would like, and this is not just a question to you, Naomi, but everyone else, and especially thinking that Constanza is from Argentina and Rigo, well, he's in North America, but I think he's from Chile, right, Rigo? No?
Where?
Guatemala, sorry. Yeah. So what do you think, given that in both those countries, actually, there is high levels of corruption, how can we as scholars, how can we as activists and socialists actually drive this agenda, given the corruption, given the nature of our economic system? Because unfortunately, as it is, though, as much as if there's still corporations that are coming and taking our resources, if there are other countries still invested in our natural resources, unfortunately, with the way big economies are still striving to be the best economy or expanding and growing, unfortunately, this is a problem that is going to persist for generations to come. How do you think, obviously I'm not asking for like a 5-year solution. I don't think it's even feasible. How do you think we can move towards that state? And then it also brings me to a question to you, Naomi, to the fact that how do we actually use the crisis for a positive change? Like you said, with an example of now COVID, like if children can be playing outdoors and everything, learning about nature, that would be good. How do we use our crisis, for instance, a war or an extreme drought, to just now use that crisis and actually overcome it by now getting better, sustainable ecological outcomes?
Did anybody else want to respond?
That's a hard one. Rigo, what do you think?
I think what she's trying to get at is, how do we use a crisis to achieve change, right? Let's say in the United States, we have these huge, I can think of what's happening here with these huge heat waves hitting the West, and a huge drought. I heard it's like 1,200-year drought, the worst in 1,200 years that's happening. The reserves are going down. So are we going to wake up from this? What is going to happen? I honestly don't see the government talking about this. They're talking about immigration. They're talking about all these other distraction things, and not focusing on like those issues. But so I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the corruption problem is universal. I don't think that Africa has any, frankly, more corrupt than the United States. It manifests differently. In the US, corruption is more legalized. But this collusion between big capital and big government is a universal problem. And I think that the beyond sort of very small scale ideas like these sort of these community certification programs, right, where you would have empower communities to be able to apply for funds directly, so that the funding isn't going from government to government only, but community into a fund. Some other examples that I find exciting are some of the things that members of the so-called squad in Congress are doing. Like, for instance, Cori Bush, who comes from the Black Lives Matter movement, was elected this time around to represent St. Louis. She has sponsored this piece of legislation called Green New Deals for cities, towns, and territories. And the whole idea is to get federal money to the subnational level, basically on the thinking that communities know what's best for them. And the more that we can devolve power to the local level, the less corruption there will be. And so this is and it's a plan to encourage and provide resources to subnational governments. So that can be a small town, that can be a big city, to come up with their own transition plans, to come up with their own visions for the post-carbon economy. And that would include transit, that would include housing, that would include agriculture. And then to get grants, not loans, grants from the federal government to finance this. You know, Rigo, you mentioned the drought that the West is experiencing right now. I've done some of my recent researches on the aftermath of the Paradise Fire it's actually called the Camp Fire in 2018, the deadliest fire in California's history. It razed an entire community to the ground. 85 people died, 26,000 structures were destroyed, I believe. And you had this big internal climate migration from one community to another. And most of the people who lost their homes in Paradise, California, went to a small city called Chico, California. Now, it's very interesting to research because Chico, California really welcomed the refugees at first. There was a huge amount of generosity, solidarity. People opened up their homes. There were soup kitchens. There was, really like a strong solidarity. And they realized that the real problem was affordable housing. There was no affordable housing, and the market was just creating more and more stress because the more people came, you leave it to the market, prices are going up. Now more people are homeless, not because of the fire, but because they can't afford to pay their rent. So they came up with a plan for a Green New Deal for Chico that would invest in housing, that would invest in real affordable housing, social housing, tiny housing, a variety of housing responses. But it also had to deal with water, agriculture, transit. And they were completely blown off. They didn't get the financing for this. And what was really horrifying to watch was how the right, the fascist right, came into this context, swept the city council, and now have just been waging war on homeless people, many of whom are survivors of the fires. And it's some of the most brutal attacks on unhoused people anywhere in the United States. And it's frankly just getting worse in a heat wave, in COVID, right? So that to me really shows that communities need to know what they need. They need to design their own solutions, but those solutions have to have a financing pipeline to federal governments who are able to actually allocate capital in a way that subnational governments can't do. And no, we can't leave it to the market because the market is the problem. The market is what's creating the crises.
Sure.
I have just a super quick comment about Loreto's, the problem that we have with the I shouldn't say developing world, the emerging world, the global South. How do we help them? And the corruption is everywhere, right? But it's corruption and debt, I would say. The corruption is together. Like the governments have many governments indebted the countries, and now they can't even invest in whatever they need to, and they keep cutting on the social services that they barely already had. and the
Yeah.
privatization, all the neoliberalism, right? Going back to circle, I guess, in what we were talking about before. So I don't know if you have seen just any, Naomi, any signs of or do you have any examples or suggestions of what can we do moving forwards to address those root causes, corruption and debt? Like they I feel like they do go together.
They absolutely go together. They absolutely go together. You know, and there is an anti-debt movement and more awareness, I think, about the corrosive impacts of debt. Now there's a great group, the Debt Collective, that is working on this in the US, and we need more and more to connect international indebtedness and those sort of local student debt, medical debt, and housing debt, and really understanding how this is just limits the horizons of people's sense of the possible on an individual level and on a collective level as well. And we need to re-energize the debt jubilee movement, I think. And it is starting to happen. It's still I mean, I'm often struck by the fact that, and this is why I think it's wonderful that you are, you know, in international dialogue with each other at this conference, is that it's one of the great ironies of our age that we've never had greater ease of international communication. And weirdly, we are less internationalist as a, you know, progressive left than and at many points in the past when it was much harder to communicate internationally. And so I think, you know, even 20 years ago, there was more of an international movement confronting the World Bank and the IMF and demanding, you know, a debt jubilee than there is today. More international coordination confronting neoliberal free trade agreements. And, you know, some of it's Facebook's problem and we're all just distracted and our brains are turning into Swiss cheese. But I do think we need to use these tools to much greater effect.
Yeah. All right. And then I'd like to go back to the intertwining social justice and ecological justice. Is it possible in our developing and underdeveloped countries? How can we go about that? It's very hard to convince someone to use a resource sustainably when they do not have food, for instance, or where, even if we talk about education programs that teach people that the ecology is not part of the economy, but the economy is part of the ecological system as a whole. But then you're talking about people who do not even have access to that education. We're talking about people who do not have access to healthcare to actually even think about, okay, let me, and funny enough, these are the people who are at these rural areas or where they're using minimal resources in the first place, you know. The problem, it stems from these multinational corporations, these big corporations who have the education, who have the information available there. But because of the economic system, because of capitalism, they will keep on digging and digging and extracting till no end. How can we absolutely stop it? How can we change it? How do we stop it? How do we change it? How do we, and especially with us, because like we in Africa would say that we have the potential to be the richest economies in the whole planet. But then we have our leaders, our political leaders, who have this influence from either, now it's China, for instance, that is just like encroaching into our economies and so forth. How do we even get to that point of saying, let's just relook the whole system, let's relook economic indicators, let's just look at it differently, let's just change the system. What little steps can we take at local level, at country level, at continental level? Do we need to change the political system even? Do we need to change is it possible?
I don't know if you know that you mentioned the name of my most recent book for young people is called How to Change Everything. So we kind of need to do it all. And I mean, I've given you some examples of ways that people are trying to use this shock that we're in right now as a wake-up call, or as Arundhati Roy said, a portal where we really hold on to the lessons of COVID about, you know, and I think picking up on what Costanza was saying earlier about what is a good life, you know, about slowing down, about less work, about more meaningful work, as opposed to just more jobs. And I think that actually there are a lot of really wonderful ideas, more ideas. Like I feel like we are in a more fertile intellectual environment than certainly we were in the tightest grips of neoliberalism. And I do think we need to change politics. And I do think part of that involves more people going into politics. I'm sorry to sound, you know, like a bit of a cliche, but, you know, the examples that I'm giving of the Green New Deal for cities and towns, or, you know, we could look at some of the great examples, you know, that have come out of Barcelona and Común, you know, or even some examples from New Zealand, you know, where they have tried to use the shock of COVID to say, okay, well, maybe we should be having a 4-day work week. And instead of relying on international travel, we have time to explore our own place a little bit more because we're not always working so hard. All of this comes from people deciding to go into politics who wouldn't normally have gone into politics. I don't think it's a panacea. But I do think that we do need more people who are not the type of people to go into politics and push it as far as they can. Yeah, that's part of it. And I think in academia, we need to be partnering with those insurgent political figures and rapidly showing the public that it is possible, that these alternatives are possible. I think there's some exciting things happening in Chile right now, with the new constitution and with, you know, eco-feminists running for office and working with local indigenous activists and really getting at the root, trying to get at the roots of extractivism. We'll see what comes out of Chile, but it's very exciting. You know, as they say, neoliberalism began here, it's going to end here too. We'll bury it. I mean, who knows? We need to support them. But you know, as we always hear, the best way to support people who are doing this work is to try to do it where we live. I'm not running for office, but my husband is running for office for the first time. It's terrifying. So I'm having my own life turned upside down by practicing what I preach on this, because I just think more of us have to actually try and do it. Or if we are in academia, really thinking about how we can do work that is useful. We need to be going into communities and saying, what research would be most useful to you? What do you need to know in order to go to your local government and actually get the resources you need? What gaps are there, and how can we be of service to you? Not, we've figured everything out and here's what you should do. And doing the same with courageous politicians. What research would be helpful to you? So bringing that kind of more of a sense of humility, I guess, to our work.
Okay. Thank you so much, Naomi, for this fulfilling and very informative session. We're truly honored to have you. If you have just one last line, take home message for us. You've already said so much, but yeah, so much.
Yeah, I would just say that the work you're doing is so critical. And, you know, this is where I think the politicians are not going to lead. That these questions around how do we take less from the earth, that's always going to be the scariest thing politically, to reckon with less, but still living well, living good, fulfilled lives. And I think the more we can go deep as researchers, as scholars, to demystify that, right? To take it beyond the slogans, to give real examples, and to show that these deeper transitions, these deeper paradigm shifts are possible, the more we will provide really usable tools for movement leaders, for political leaders who want to go further. So this is really critical work, and it's been an honor to be in dialogue with you. And as I said, I'm really heartened and moved by your internationalism and the way and the conversations you're having with each other. So Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Joshua Farley, for inviting me and for everything that you've done for so long, advancing ecological economics. We need so much more of it.
So hello, everyone. You're probably a bit surprised to see me pop in at the end of a video of Naomi Klein. Unfortunately, we tried to have her live, but she had a family reunion to attend to, and she very kindly agreed to participate in a conversation with some young activists, is what she requested. And so we chose Lorato, Constanza, and Rigo is three ecological economic degrowth academics and activists to try to shift the conversation away from the global north and towards the south, and doing it with Naomi, who's has a fantastic history of popularizing and disseminating the ideas of how do we achieve a socially just sustainability transition. And my only role in this whole thing was to coordinate the event. And so all I'm doing now is to turn this over to a question answer conversation with the three interviewers of Naomi, so Lorato, Constanza, and Rigo. And so they've been looking at the messages, and I will step back here and turn the panel over to them. So thanks for watching, and we're sorry Naomi can't be here live, but have to understand family issues.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We had a great time with Naomi, as you can tell, and we asked her a lot of questions ourselves, but many of you have been asking and commenting a lot about many issues. And I just wanted to start off by saying that we thought that the title of the panel made sense because we're trying to address, we need to have systemic change. And there's a lot of greenwashing going on, and even in academia, a lot of it is pervasive, and we need to move on from it. And ecological economics has the ability to do that, and that's kind of like why we are here today. So I'm going to start with, I mean, there's a lot of questions, but I'm going to start with a question on what should be the role of North America, and especially the US, in the sustainability transformation, considering its historic role as an imperial power, global police of neoliberal capitalism, and large consumer of energy and materials. Well, that's a tough question, but what I can start by saying that, well, we need to start by helping the global South as much as we can with resources. We need to like transfer as much of the wealth that we can to them, financial wealth. We need to teach people in North America and the United States that you cannot just be consuming 25% of the world's resources, because that's just not okay. Most people don't even realize it because it's all part of the system in which, neoliberalism is just the deregulation that has been going on since the 80s in the financial sector and in all sectors of the US economy, and then exported to the rest of the world, has just been about how do we consume less. It's all about consuming more to enrich the powerful few. And I think right now we are we are pivoting. We need to pivot away from this, and I think there's a lot of hope with what's going on in the U.S. government. Although sometimes you might think that there isn't, but yeah, that, and we need to teach people, I think, about ecological economics. We need to teach people about the nature of energy, the behavioral changes that we need to come from a realization that what all the inputs into the economic system need to be taken into account, and that our actions have consequences. And most people nowadays just have no idea, don't even stop to think about it. And that is one of the main obstacles, I would say, for the US, especially with this huge role. Although I have to say, today we all know that China produces double the emissions of the United States. So we have another huge problem with China, which is like 30% of the emissions. The US has done it historically, but today is just 15%, which is still a lot. And we need to transform our energy systems as fast as we can. And we need to basically, allow people to also obtain a technology. Something that Josh talks a lot about is this freedom of information. Like, do not patent everything, because when you do that, you don't let others improve on the technology. And I believe strongly that what we need to do is have everyone working on improving the energy return investments of all the technologies, so that we can actually, get more returns, and we don't have to, build as many wind turbines or put up as many solar panels, which consume a lot of fossil fuel energy themselves. As of right now, China's building most of them. And if the US is going to try to do that, we also need to think, not just in a Green New Deal scenario for the US and Europe, think about how we can use our own renewable energy resources as much as we can to produce our renewable energy technologies. Because as of right now, everything still depends on fossil fuels. So I don't know, but the US has a big role to play, and I think we're going to continue working on this and be hopeful. But I'm just going to say we need to invest in education, in ecological economic education, and to fight off the neoliberal economic departments which run the country, to be honest with you. So someone else wants to take over it. Constanza's going to come over. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I was just looking at this few last questions. What do you see as the most dangerous greenwashing in academia? And also the next one is very good. It's capitalism, not just neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a logical outcome of capitalism, ideology and institutions. I think this is all tied together. For me, the most dangerous greenwashing in academia, especially in ecological economics, actually, is the ecosystem services framework and the use of the valuation, the monetary valuation, as a way to make better decisions regarding our environmental policy or our relationship with environment. Like all our decisions have to be about or based in a cost-benefit analysis, where we have every ecosystem service, the prices of everything, the costs, the monetary value of everything, so we can compare between them and then make the best decision. And this, for me, is the most dangerous, the most dangerous greenwashing in academia. And regarding the and actually, this relates to a commentary that one person said. I'm sorry, I'm trying to find it. Lori Kaufman said, greenwashing after the pandemic, and said every politician and pundit keeps saying, let's beat the pandemic and get back to growing the economy. Nobody's saying economic growth causes pandemics. It always has. Thoughts? Well, actually, I think, yeah, totally, I agree. I think, and I would like to make a relation here between the pandemic as a crisis and the climate crisis, and how both of them have been co-opted by some sort of way to keep business as usual. Like in pandemic crisis, there are big winners, like pharmaceutical companies or Amazon or Facebook and internet, and maybe the owners of Zoom that we're using right now. I don't know, but I mean, just as some people make crises are always an opportunity for some to make more money. So the idea would be how to make this crisis work for us, and not like climate crisis is doing now, that is working for business as usual through ecosystem services schemes, right? Like payment for carbon, like carbon markets. So those are a bit my thoughts about that. And finally, I think this idea of capitalism is capitalism the problem and not neoliberalism. I totally agree. And the problem is exactly that we have lost track that it's about property, right? It's about private property. in a big way. And neoliberalism and the fight against neoliberalism, I think sometimes loses track of that, right? That a big problem is unequal, a very unequal way of distributing goods in the world. And that has to do with property, right? Like land grabbing, or now we're talking green grabbing. The private property imaginary advances on commons that hadn't been privatized yet. Is this going to happen to forests because they provide clean oxygen? Is this going to keep happening? Maybe to oceans? Who's going to approve? Is privatization a way to a solution? Well, I think that is in the root of the fight, not against neoliberalism, but capitalism, totally. And I think, yeah, we need to get back in track with that. So yeah, thank you for these comments and questions, because they're all great. Many. I don't know, Lerato, if you wanted to.
Okay. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for your comments and taking part in this session. I'm going to tackle about 2 or 3 of the questions. I think the first one that I saw was on the role of China, and is it some sort of new, greenwashing, as phrased. I think that it's a very serious issue that really needs to be taken into consideration, particularly by ecological economists and everyone who's up for, who advocates for sustainable environment and ecological system. So it's not that they're lending a hand to developing countries. It's more of, we're coming there to make profits, and they might build a road. It's not to improve infrastructure, but it's to make things easier for their processes. So unless the entire economic system changes, unfortunately, there's nothing that will change. We're not going to get to a point of a steady state. What would happen then is that if the economic system changes, for instance, I mean, China would go to Sierra Leone, for instance, and build a port. It's going to create a couple of jobs in that particular area with enormous consequences on the ecosystem and the environment of the whole country. And we look at a couple of jobs created per area with barely minimum wages directed, and it's unfortunate. And the problem with such discussions, especially, most people will move to the point that saying, well, people should do the smallest things in their homes, in the communities and everything. But like I said in the conversation with Naomi, is that unfortunately the poorest are the ones who consume less of our environment, are the ones who exploit our environments less. So it's even, well, in Africa, it's actually even with our political systems. And like we said, the plague of corruption in our developing states prohibits any sustainable movements forward, because everyone has a vested interest in making the most of whatever it is for their own benefit. So as long as we live in a system where it's to try to minimize costs to make profits, unfortunately, it is hard to convince people to even get to a point of thinking about the environment. We can have education. I think even when I was in school, we were taught about the environment, the ecological system, how to try to sustain it, and so forth. We can learn this. I, as Lerato, and the community around me can do something about it. But unfortunately, as long as we have multinational corporations coming in and what we have labeled as sort of klepto-capitalism, people coming in, taking resources and so forth, unfortunately, it is not going to change anything. And it's even worse, especially when you're considering the concept of degrowth. It's even worse now that even with the little that the people have, we still need to tell them that you need to consume less or to consume better, it's very hard. There's always going to be that struggle, for instance, to consume more, because at this point you have less. Consuming more means that you're in a better state of some sort of social welfare. So it becomes very hard in the developing context and developing country context. But I really, really feel that the key problem lies in the economic system, which we have often we've looked at the economic system as separate from the ecological system. And if we keep on looking at it that way, there is no amount of education, I believe, that would, or interventions at local level could actually change anything in the long run. I think if someone else wants to go through.
There was one question that a fellow from my country made, and I wanted to maybe get the opportunity to answer it, to Franco Perotti. I hope you're listening. He asks if it's possible to articulate long-term conservation policies and sustainability conservation politics, and sustainability politics in countries like Argentina, no? where we have like very different and contradictory policies working at the same time, right? Like we have Argentina is a country that lives from the exports of agriculture and the advancement of the agriculture frontier, especially soybean, and cattle also moving, and so forests are destroyed because cattle needs a place to move to, and then we have also, you know, conservation politics of national forests that, well, it's long, so to explain here, but I think I guess where he's coming from. I think that the problem is that we keep thinking of conservation and production as two different things, right? That's in the origin of sustainable development. The idea was to move past this dichotomy between conservation and production. We haven't, of course, and sustainability is just economic sustainability, right? And not really ecological sustainability. So we need to go back to that idea. I think Rigo may second me in this and explain it better than me, to go back to the idea of the ecological grounds of our economic system. And maybe that way, and I think ecological economics has a lot to give in that respect. And I think maybe in that way we can move past this dichotomy. But I don't think conservation policies are the answer. Like the conservation policies as we know them today, like national parks, you know, more restrictions, because those restrictions usually exclude people from the possibility to live in those places, like forests, right? So indigenous community, peasants that are forced to move to cities. And well, it's all part of a loop of a vicious circle that we need to break. And I don't think conservation policies is the answer. But it's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel, I guess.
Yeah, and if I just may jump, I would like to jump in with you, since I think we're all in agreement as academic activists, and many of my peers here at UVM, even McGill and York University, I mean, people, the L4E program and the E4A programs, that ecological economics, you know, was created more than a little bit of 30 years ago to do a paradigm shift in economic thinking, and to basically, you know, think of the economy as needs to be studied both equally, biophysically and socially, so we can actually address all these sustainability problems. And I think it needs to be regrounded in a way. Ecological economics, I think, is even the journal, for example, we've had a lot of discussions about how the journal needs to reflect that paradigm shift vision that it was created to do. I mean, and we also need to not shy away from being activists, because at this point, there's a comment that somebody said that they loved how Naomi, well, it's the person Maria one says, I want to cry when Naomi said academics need to do research that is useful. I've been trying so hard to try to do this through my PhD, and I still, in my activities outside of academia, seem to be of any use. So she's saying that basically her activities outside of academia are more useful than her PhD, maybe. But I think that's something that we have to reflect on, and from the, our elders and the people who have done a lot of work in putting this together, I think we need to move to a new phase, especially now that if the IPCC is right, that we have 10 years to actually get our act together, especially, transitioning away from carbon fuels. We have to focus our research as much as we can in creating policy recommendations. The journals should be asking, you have highlights. You should have a section right after highlights that says, what are the policy recommendations from your article? And yeah, that's I think all our peers are in agreement that we need to do that. And yes, move away from band-aids, because that's, like Constanza has been saying, ecosystem services have a place in ecological economics, but it should not be, that is not going to the root causes. And we need to address the root causes, and we need to do it as soon as we can, because we are running out of time. But Loretta, you want to go?
Yeah, just one brief thing. I think what you're saying is very important, that we need to have these recommendations that can actually be implemented and we can see change. Another thing is that I saw in the comments, someone was mentioning how we need to reduce below a certain income gap, income cap. What I can say is that unfortunately, we cannot have a one size fits all sort of policies and everything in solving this crisis that we have currently. It's going to differ per region, per place, because for instance, if we have to go with that reduction in income gap, we have massive inequalities in our societies in the global south. We talk about fast growing economies, but there's still a lot of people going poorer, and it's a very small percentage of the people that are actually okay. So even if we had to say that above a certain cap, then you need to reduce your consumption and so forth, it's going to be very little people who actually do that. And it brings me back to the point that in certain areas, in certain places, it's not communities or societies that contribute to the depletion of our resources, but the rich, So we need to really think of, even when we're doing our research, let's consider, let's not come up, when we're coming up with these policy recommendations, let's consider the different contexts, the different regions, the different income distributions across the world. Let's consider how the landscape, the biophysical landscape, when we're doing this. It's very, like in the past, we've seen that you've had policy recommendations and frameworks and everything. That is, that someone came up in North America trying to implement it in Africa. It won't work, And so I'm really glad that we can have such discussions and platforms where we can discuss from different regions, and we can voice out how we're looking our perspectives from our different regional contexts. It's very important that as academics, we really push for policy recommendations that are inclusive and cognizant of the differences that we face in our daily lives. Yeah.
I would just like to say thank you to Naomi Klein for joining us, and for you, Loretta, for joining us from South Africa, and for Constanza for joining us from Argentina. I would love to keep talking, maybe in the social breakup groups. If anyone wants to, I will be there. I don't know if you guys can be there. And thanks, Josh, for inviting us. And I don't know if you guys want to say a few words. Thank you, words. I'm done. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity, Joshua, for well, it's been great. It's been I've learned a lot, and these questions from the public have been very good and make me, some of them I'm going to keep in mind for future thoughts. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Lerato. Thank you, Rigo. It's been great.
Thank you, everyone. It was nice meeting you and being part of this wonderful discussion, and particularly for meeting Naomi. Thank you so much for the organizers, and I wish everyone happy evening on my end.